Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm sharing a story that you might have actually lived through yourself, and trust me, it's a love story. Are you ready? Let's go! She was 62 years old, standing in her own gallery, when she felt something she had not felt in decades, and it was coming from a 30-year-old man covered in paint. What she discovered about why he had never loved anyone before her was so heartbreaking that she said it changed everything she thought she knew about loneliness. Oh my goodness, girls, you are absolutely not going to believe the story I am about to tell you tonight. I came across this story a few weeks ago, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. So pour yourself a glass of wine, get comfortable, and listen to what happened to this woman named Margaret. Because what she went through completely changed the way I think about love, loneliness, and the kind of courage it takes to open your heart when you are convinced that chapter of your life is already over. Margaret was 62 years old, and she had spent the last 31 years building something truly beautiful in the heart of Chicago. Her art gallery on North Michigan Avenue was not just a business, it was her whole identity. She had named it Hollow Light Gallery, and every single painting on those white walls had been chosen personally by her. She had an eye for emotion. She could walk into a room full of artwork and immediately find the one piece that had something real behind it, something raw, something that felt like it had been pulled out of someone's chest rather than painted with a brush. People in the Chicago art world respected her enormously for that. But respect is not warmth, and Margaret had been living without warmth for a very long time. Her marriage had ended 11 years earlier, not dramatically. Not with screaming or betrayal, it had simply ended the way a fire ends when there is nothing left to burn. She and her ex-husband Daniel had looked at each other one morning over coffee, and both understood simultaneously that they had become strangers who shared a mortgage. The divorce was quiet and civil and absolutely devastating in its own way. They had no children. Margaret had chosen her gallery the way some women choose their families, and for a long time that had felt like enough. But by the time she turned 60, she had started waking up at 3 a.m. with a feeling she could not name. Not sadness exactly, more like an awareness of how silent her apartment was, how nobody was going to text her good morning, how the side of her bed that Daniel used to sleep on had been empty for over a decade and she had stopped even looking at it. She told herself she was fine. Women like Margaret do not fall apart. They curate, they organize, they move forward. And she did move forward. She expanded the gallery. She hired 2 new assistants. She started a monthly artist residency program that brought emerging painters and sculptors to Chicago from all over the country. That is how she met him. That is how she met a young man named Eli. Eli was 29 years old when he arrived at Hollow Light Gallery on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a portfolio that was falling apart at the seams. Margaret almost did not see him. She was on the phone dealing with a shipping issue, and her assistant Claire had been handling the residency interviews that day. But something made her look up from her desk through the glass wall of her office, and when she saw him standing there in the waiting area, she paused mid-sentence. Not because he was extraordinarily handsome, though he was, but because of the way he was holding that falling apart portfolio, like it contained something sacred. Like losing it would mean losing a part of himself that he could never recover. She told her caller she would phone them back, and she walked out to meet him herself. His work was unlike anything she had seen in years. He painted loneliness the way other artists paint landscapes, with depth and light and an almost unbearable beauty. His figures were always alone, always in the middle of something vast, an empty highway, a beach at sunrise, a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. But they never looked defeated. They looked like they were waiting, like they believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that something was coming. Margaret hired him on the spot and gave him the largest studio space in the residency wing. For the first 2 months, Eli was professional and quiet and deeply focused on his work. He arrived before anyone else and often stayed after Margaret had locked up the front gallery doors. She would find him in the studio when she came back to retrieve something she had forgotten, standing in front of a canvas with a look of such complete concentration that she felt guilty for interrupting him. They developed a habit of talking during those late evenings. At first about art, then about Chicago, then about their lives. Margaret noticed things about Eli that she could not stop noticing. He never mentioned anyone waiting for him at home. He never referenced a girlfriend, a date, a text he needed to answer. When the other residents gathered for the monthly social dinners that Margaret hosted at the gallery, Eli came, but always sat slightly apart from the group, not unfriendly, just genuinely more comfortable at the edges. One of the other residents, a sculptor named Diane, had told Margaret privately that she thought Eli was the most emotionally intelligent person she had ever met, but that talking to him felt like standing outside a house with every window lit and every door locked. Margaret understood that feeling immediately. One evening in December, about 3 months into the residency, a snowstorm kept everyone else away from the gallery. Margaret had come in anyway because she had a shipment to prepare. She found Eli in the studio as usual. She made 2 cups of coffee in the small kitchen off the main hall and brought one to him without asking if he wanted it. He looked at the cup and then at her and said thank you in a voice that made her think he meant something larger than the coffee. They talked for 4 hours that night. She learned that Eli had grown up in a small town in rural Ohio, the only child of a single mother who had worked 2 jobs and loved him fiercely, but had very little time. He had been a quiet kid who spent most of his childhood drawing in notebooks and reading and largely invisible to the social world around him. He had gone to art school in Cincinnati on a partial scholarship and worked nights at a gas station to cover the rest. He was talented enough that his professors had told him he was the most gifted student they had seen in a decade. That kind of attention had felt wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. And then Margaret asked him gently the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind for months. She asked him why he always seemed so alone, the way he looked at her when she asked that question. She said she would never forget it as long as she lived. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has just said the exact thing they have been waiting years to hear and are not sure they are ready for. He told her about his body, not in a graphic way, just honestly. He told her that when he was 19 years old and in his first year of art school, he had met a girl named Amber who he had cared about deeply. They had been together for several months, and when they finally became physically close, her reaction had been one of shock and then withdrawal. She had not been cruel, but she had been frightened, and she had left. He had tried again 2 more times in the years that followed, and both experiences had ended in similar ways. One woman had laughed. One woman had told him he was not normal. After that, he had simply stopped trying. He had decided that his body made intimacy impossible and that he was going to have to build a life without it. He had poured everything he felt into his painting. That was why his figures were always alone, because he believed he always would be. He was 30 years old and he had never been in a real relationship. He had never been told that he was loved, and he had accepted that this was simply who he was. Margaret sat with that for a long time before she said anything, and then she said something that Eli told people later had rearranged something fundamental inside of him. She said that she had spent 31 years running a gallery, and that the most valuable thing she had ever learned in that time was that the pieces that made people uncomfortable at first were almost always the ones that changed them the most. That what people called too much was usually just more than they had been taught to expect. And that the right person would not walk away. The right person would stay and learn. Eli did not say anything for a long time after that. And then he said her name. Just her name. Margaret. And the way he said it. She told the person who shared this story that she had not felt that particular feeling. That specific electricity of being truly seen by another human being since she was in her early 30s. She had forgotten it was possible at 62. She had genuinely believed that part of her life was finished, closed, filed away. It was not finished. Over the following months, something grew between them that neither of them had planned and both of them had needed more than they knew. It was not fast. It was not reckless. It was the opposite of reckless. It was careful and honest and full of real conversation. Margaret was 62 years old and Eli was 30, and neither of them pretended that was not complicated. They talked about it openly, about what people would say, about the 32-year difference, about whether what they were building could hold the weight of the real world. They decided it could. Girls, I have been sitting with this story for weeks now, and every time I think about it, I feel something loosen in my chest. Because I think so many of us reach a certain age and we quietly close a door inside ourselves. We decide that certain things are no longer available to us. Love, being chosen, mattering to someone in that specific, irreplaceable way, We tell ourselves we are being realistic. We tell ourselves we are being mature. But Margaret's story makes me wonder how many of us are just being afraid. She was 62 years old and she had written off an entire dimension of human experience. And then a young man walked into her gallery with a falling apart portfolio and a secret he had been carrying alone for over a decade. And they healed each other, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but genuinely. I think that is the part that gets me the most, not the romance of it, the genuineness of it. Two people who had both decided they were too broken for love and then proved themselves wrong together.